Hello watch enthusiasts! Now today, as is the case every month, I'd like to speak about good value vintage watches. And this month there's been a variety of different pieces in a wide range of different prices, with this video including everything from a somewhat underappreciated but highly influential 1980s Seiko, through a rather interesting Omega Seamaster, and a Grand Seiko which offers a really wonderful insight into the genesis of this iconic brand. Now the first piece I'd like to speak about is a model from Eterna which I've spoken about before on the channel, and in fact which I've spoken about a few months ago on this very same series of good value vintage watches. However, with these pieces, the interesting thing is that whilst their prices did go up for a while, they've now dropped again, as is the case so often with the watch industry. But the Eternas I'd like to speak about today are perhaps a bit more vague than one would normally discuss in this video. Because today I'd like to simply speak about the Eterna-Matic models. And the interesting thing about the Eterna-Matic models is they were released in 1948 as the first movement with ball bearings placed on the rotor bearing in the centre. And what this meant was that the watch had an automatic winding rotor which had far less resistance and far less friction than you would have normally. And so this gave birth really to the technology we see on a great deal of watches nowadays, including most ETA movements. And I feel that in this mid-century period, in terms of looking back for vintage watches, Eterna are often overlooked, but in truth their history is extremely important because they underpin the creation of ETA, the largest manufacturer of movements in the Swiss watch industry. And their movements were the direct ancestors of these modern movements we use today, and have been used as widely as in Omega and IWC, for example. And so in terms of their history, Eterna certainly are very, very well represented by their innovation. And interestingly, this Eterna-Matic innovation of those 5 ball bearings created their logo, which is these five circular balls, which sit above the Eterna logo on the dial and on the crown. Now it is crucial to note that with these pieces there is a wide variety in the way of different movements, because depending on whether you get a version which features a date or no date, or a different series of movements made by Eterna across the years, these can all be branded as Eterna-Matic as a result of this innovation. But certainly all of them share the characteristic of having that Eterna-Matic rotor bearing, as well as having automatic winding of course. But one also sees wide variety in the cases, and perhaps even more variety than in the movements from the perspective of the owner's input to the watch. Because one sees everything from the very delicate centenaire models, which appear more like dress watches, to the far more robust and in some ways more modern Kontiki models, which were released originally in 1947 in another form to commemorate Thor Heyerdahl and his travels as an explorer. And so with prices ranging between £200 and £550 for a more ornate model or a more sought-after piece in better condition, I think these offer an incredible deal because they compete really very, very well with an entry-level Swiss automatic on the modern market. And so with these pieces you're able to have a very attractive entry into the vintage market, whilst not giving too much of a threat to the individual if they want to explore this market for the first time maybe. But also for seasoned collectors, these are interesting pieces to have in a collection, with a really interesting history in terms of their influence to the evolution of watches, but also simply in terms of showing Eterna as a really impressive brand of their era. Now the following piece is a rather unlikely model from Seiko from the early 1980s. But to really understand this piece one has to look at its origins. Because Seiko had been producing quartz watches since the late 1960s, although in the 10 years before this watch was produced, they really had reduced the price of these watches very significantly, bearing in mind the fact that their first models with quartz movements in their Astron line cost the equivalent of the price of a car. However, by this stage in the early 1980s, all quartz chronographs featured digital displays, and so as a result were very far removed from a classically correct wristwatch. And so in the early 1980s they innovated and created a rather interesting piece in the form of the 7A28. And the 7A28 was a quartz movement which was conceived to be a more classically correct alternative, because it featured all the accuracy advantages of a quartz movement, however it encased it in the form of a tricompact style of chronograph with an analogue display. Now aside from being an impressive piece in its own right, the movement inside this watch has a few interesting features which do very much demonstrate the fact that this watch was not designed to be an affordable alternative to a standard mechanical watch, but rather a standalone product providing this accuracy of quartz movements and true quality. Because one sees an entirely metal movement with plates and bridges in a way which is more akin, certainly on first sight, to a mechanical movement than a quartz movement. This is also mirrored by the fact that it has 15 joules, an almost unheard of number in a chronograph style of quartz movement in the present day. And so one does see the aim of Seiko with this timepiece to produce something which really wasn't designed to be a budget option. But where the movement was concerned, one also had a few interesting complications, such as, of course, that chronograph function with a 20th of a second style of display using that subdial at the 3 o'clock position. But these movements also had features which simply were inaccessible at an affordable price from mechanical movement, and features like this include the use of a split-second function, and by so doing you could halt the chronograph hands without stopping the watch from timing, and so when you press the button again it would jump back to the running time, thus allowing you to be able to take a measurement of time whilst not having stopped the chronograph. And aside from this, one had a variety of different versions of these movements, with perhaps the most well-known being the 7A28, which was the no-date version with the tricompax layout, but there were also versions such as the 7A38, which I will also be addressing in this video, and that's the day-date model. But then of course there are exotic versions with things like moon phases, for example, which just add to this line as a very interesting piece in the Seiko range. But then just to add to the history of this watch, and also the appeal of this timepiece, one has to look at the use of this watch, because not only was this model used by Roger Moore in A View to a Kill, but one also saw this watch used by the South African Air Force and the Royal Air Force in their general use, and so one sees these watches quite regularly come up with military markings and bead-blasted cases. And of course those pieces do come at a much higher price than most of these watches. If you are a collector of military watches, they are a very interesting direction to go if you want something very, very different. But the standard versions, which one sees without the bezel, for example, which are the most delicate with the tachymeter, one sees a 37mm case with brushed and polished areas, but one also sees versions with rotating bezels, which are also an interesting counterpart if you want something more rugged. But the recurring theme with these watches is that there is just such a wide variety of different versions, with silvered dials or matte black dials, all the way through from bead-blasted cases to very finely polished and brushed versions. And so it really does pay to take a look and see simply what's available on the market, because at the moment these are doing extremely well in terms of being affordable, with prices ranging between £500 and if you want to go all the way for a military marked version, £1,200. However, for the vast majority of people who are going for a more standard version, you will be looking at that £500 to £600 mark. And bearing in mind the history of this watch, the history of its movement, and the impact it had on watches as a whole, this really is an underrated piece. The next piece is also a Seiko, however this time it's a Grand Seiko and does step up the quality somewhat. However, this is also a much older piece than that 1980s piece, harking back to the 1960s. Because with Grand Seiko, if you want to get the very first Grand Seiko produced, you will end up spending quite a great deal to get a version in good condition. And likewise, if you want one of their first high beat movements, you'll also pay a very handsome price. However, sitting between them is the reference 5722/9990. And this is a piece which was the second piece released by Grand Seiko, and their first watch with a date. And this manually wound piece shows a really wonderful balance between Grand Seiko's very early, very delicate dress watches and their later far more robust designs. Because with this piece the design truly is the standout feature, with a really beautiful 36.5mm case with these ultra-wide lugs which give phenomenal balance to the case and offset that highly delicate dial very well. Predictably for a Grand Seiko of this era, one sees magnificent finishing throughout, with beautiful polishing on the lugs around the sides of the case, on that wonderful bezel, in addition to some brushing on the case back and around the back of the lugs themselves. And it's detailing like this which really makes these pieces stand out. But aside from this, one notes these are chronometer certified, or at least were in their period, and one also sees on their case back a rather beautiful golden medallion, which is often a victim of wear on these pieces, but as a result of their slightly higher price, as opposed to the standard styles of Seikos of the era, one tends to see them in better condition because they weren't worn quite as aggressively. Now, in terms of the design of the dial, one has a very simple layout with a sunburst silver effect, but with the wonderful applied Seiko logo at 12 o'clock, with chronometer underneath it, and then Grand Seiko Diashock 35 joules beneath that. Notably for this model, one also has the date at the 3 o'clock position, which is nicely windowed and framed, in addition to applied indices across the dial, and hands which in typical Grand Seiko style are Dauphine hands, with these polished, beveled and cut edges. And if you remove the case back of this watch, which incidentally guaranteed a 50-metre water resistance, which was the first, in fact, of the Grand Seiko line to feature this, and also was the first Grand Seiko to be able to come in line with the Rolex Oyster, where water resistance was concerned, one sees the caliber 5722A or the B version. And these were manually wound movements built by Grand Seiko for these watches. And they ran at 19,800 vibrations per hour, a very typical beat rate for the era, and featured 35 jewels, which really is an overkill count for a watch of this type, but does give a really wonderful look to the back of these watches, with the jewels suspended in that triangle in the centre of the bridge. But the finishing on this movement is really rather beautiful, with those gilt areas of text, in addition to brushing and polishing on various elements. And whilst this movement is very much an item of its era, it's a really beautiful thing to behold, and a nice touch, especially bearing in mind the fact that it's very different to the movements that came before and after. And so, considering the historical importance of these pieces, and also the fact they are such truly beautiful watches, with angles and bevels and polished surfaces which are simply incredible for the period, and simply of any time at all, bearing in mind the fact that these provide a really wonderful counterpart to something like a 60s Seamaster from Omega, or indeed a Rolex Oyster from that period. And the price for these watches varies quite significantly depending on where you buy them from, and also what condition they're in. But once you've paid import duty, which is something to factor in, you'll pay between £1,000 and £2,000, though more likely for a good one between £1,200 and about £2,000, making for a very interesting piece as a counterpart really to another watch in this sort of price bracket, and I suppose therefore competes more directly with something like a Rolex Oyster Precision. And I must say, between the two, I think this is the more interesting piece, just because you're so unlikely to see someone else with one. Now, this penultimate piece I'd like to speak about is a model which is often seen in terms of a counterpart to Omega Speedmasters of the 1960s. Because this is the Seamaster reference 145.006, and is a very interesting piece in its own right. And this watch is often discussed in the context of having the Omega Caliber 321, the extremely revered manually wound chronograph used in Speedmasters of the 1960s. However, I'd like to set that question of movements aside for a second, and just talk about this watch in its own right first of all, because I think in its own right this is a really marvellous piece of design, and a beautiful model which reflects the 1960s and also Omega's aspirations for the 70s extremely well. Because one sees in the relatively small 37mm case a really beautiful layout, with brushing on the top of the case, beautiful polished bevels, and an extremely elegant side profile with a subtle curve to the case. One also has a sort of a tonneau style to the form of this watch, except unlike other later Omegas with these tonneau cases, like for example my Mark III Speedmaster, this watch features open lugs. And what this means is that the case doesn't actually cover the end piece of a bracelet or the end of a strap, but instead allows them to be visible. And the beauty of this is it means that more straps will fit these watches, and also means that changing straps is much more convenient, which I think are both benefits to having a watch like this, which is more slender than a Speedmaster. One also has a layout where one has a domed style of plexiglass crystal on the front of the watch, with a tachymeter equal to that used on Speedmasters placed beneath the crystal instead of rounded in the form of a bezel. And the dial itself is a thing of really very, very pure beauty, and comes in a number of variants with black, silvers and reverse panda dials available. And generally the reverse panda dials are the ones which are most aesthetically pleasing for most people, but any of the three can be extremely interesting anyway. One also sees accents in orange, black, blue or red depending upon the version, and whether you get it in steel or in gold. And aside from being some of the most elegant chronographs of the late 1960s and early 1970s, they also feature one characteristic on the dials which is rather interesting, and that's the choice to put radial numerals on the subdials. And those who know their Speedmasters will know that these are most commonly seen on Omega Alaska Project Speedmasters, where they had the numerals running around the outside of the subdials, and this very particular style. And whilst these aren't directly connected in terms of their functions, or indeed in terms of their designs, this element does show a different facet to Omega's design of that period, which I think is very interesting and simply would be inaccessible in Speedmaster. Now, where movements are concerned, this watch becomes slightly more complicated, because in the form which I've been talking about, the 145.006, you get the famous caliber 321. And the 321 in brief is a movement which was based and indeed derived very directly from Lemania movements of the 1940s. And this is known for being an extremely well-made chronograph movement, and one which featured a few elements such as the column wheel, which distinguished this movement as something really very special from its period, and in terms of the build, these were very, very well made. But in terms of its appeal, it is a more collectible movement than later 861s because of these technical innovations, but also because it's viewed as very much the heyday of Omega movements, which is certainly fair to say. However, you can get, if you want, a slightly later version of this watch which looks almost indistinguishable from the early 70s, and this features the caliber 861. And each of these two movements has a very particular appeal. For the historical purists, the 321 is perhaps the way to go, because there isn't a price difference between these watches, which is strange for a watch which comes with these two very different calibers. But the 321 is historically perhaps the most interesting, in terms of being the origin of Omega's line of later chronographs in the manually wound, and also the early generation of automatic forms, with movements such as the 861 and also the 1040, the famous first automatic chronograph from Omega, being derived, admittedly loosely, from this movement. However, the 861 does have benefits too. For a start, it's much more similar to a modern Omega chronograph, and so as a result parts should be easier to find, and service centres capable of servicing these pieces will be more common. You also do get a higher beat rate from the 861, running at 21,600 vibrations per hour to the 18,000 of the 321, whilst also getting the addition of a composite break for the seconds. And whilst this isn't perhaps the purest choice of metal, it does mean that wear tends to take longer to accumulate, and as a result of this part it is more similar to modern movements. But I think either way these are beautiful watches, and you can get them in really phenomenal condition because of their more dress-orientated style. And pricing for these starts at about £2,750, running up to about £3,250, depending upon the version you get, with £4,000 and up being the area where you might find the gold version, or a steel version in particularly immaculate condition. Now the final piece I'd like to speak about is one which I've spoken about on the channel before, but which I feel deserves a place on this list because I feel this is the end of this model still being affordable, or at least vaguely affordable. Because this is the Breitling 806, or the first generation Navitimer. And this 41mm pilot's chronograph really defined the design that we associate both with Breitling, but also with general aviation chronographs. And before I speak about why this watch is such remarkable value by comparison to other alternatives, one has to look at this watch's history. Because they were released in the 1950s as a sort of a successor, really, or at least an evolution of the Chronomat. And the Chronomat was very much a different watch to what we have today, and was far more similar to the Breitling Navitimer in its form, using slide rule bezels. But this watch featured an interesting design because at 41mm it was by no means small, but had quite short lugs, and in many ways looks quite modern if one handles one. Now there's a very significant difference between the first generation of Navitimer in general, and the very first examples produced. Because in the early 1950s there were pre-Navitimer versions without the Navitimer branding, using Velujue 72 movements, the same in fact used by Rolex in the early Daytonas. However, by the mid-1950s, and indeed by 1959, which was the point at which most Navitimers were produced after, and indeed 1959 was around the time when they changed from all black dials to these reverse panda styles, one has to see this period as very much the main area where you'll find these watches from the late 50s and the early 60s. And they used the Venus 178 manual caliber running at 18,000 vibrations per hour, and a movement which was seen quite extensively across the industry in the period, and provides a very decent operation for these watches, and I think is a very suitable movement considering the fact these were designed to be tool watches, and not designed to be overly ornate or decorated apart from having true functionality. And aside from the fact that this watch defined the rest of Breitling's aesthetic for the next 60 or so years, this is a piece which has a much more pure aesthetic to later Breitlings, because more modern Breitlings are designed to be luxury watches, whereas this piece was never intended to be so. And whilst that's certainly not a derogatory remark for either watch, whether it's the modern, more luxurious models, or this piece, it makes them very different beasts, and I think makes them both interesting in their own right. And in addition to this watch's very rich aviation history in terms of being used both commercially and privately as a pilot's watch in the 1960s, and of course the 50s as well, this watch was a piece which had also a bit of history in space. Because whilst the first astronaut Alan Shepard for NASA went up in space in 1961, this was the first notable chronograph used in space, and very famously was destroyed upon landing in the sea, when worn by Scott Carpenter in the Aurora 7 mission in 1962. But what's still very remarkable about these watches is the fact that they remain accessible in terms of pricing. And whilst other models from Breitling of this period, such as the 765 Copilot, which I think incidentally is one of the most beautiful watches ever made by Breitling, is selling for over £15,000 now, the Navitimer is available in this 806 reference for between £3,000 and £5,000, making it a surprisingly affordable option if you have the sort of money to spend on, for example, an automatic Omega Speedmaster of the present day. This could be an interesting alternative on the vintage market. But prices do appear to be on the rise with these pieces, which does suggest that within a few months or a few years, these may no longer be accessible to the vast majority of us, even if at the moment they are still expensive, but are still within reach for a great deal of people. And so this is why I felt it was appropriate to speak about these in this video, because I think it is worth noting these pieces before they reach the realms of high-end collectors, which are very difficult to access if you have a relatively reasonable budget. But with that, I'll conclude the video here. But do tell me in the comments down below what you thought of this video and of my choices this month. And if you did enjoy the video, then please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to be able to see more videos and content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Armand the Watch Guy, out.